Officer Sarah Mitchell had been a K-9 handler for the Riverside Police Department for 15 years, and in that time, she'd learned to trust three things: her instincts, her training, and Duke, her German Shepherd partner of 8 years. The October evening started like any other patrol shift. She was cruising through the residential neighborhoods of Riverside, Duke resting peacefully in the specially equipped rear compartment of her patrol car, his dark eyes half closed in that state of relaxed alertness that only working dogs possessed. Sarah had logged over 5,000 patrol hours with Duke, and their connection had transcended the professional realm long ago. They weren't just partners, they were family. The shift had been quiet, almost meditative. Sarah enjoyed these peaceful patrols, though she knew they rarely lasted. She'd stop by his coffee shop around 8 p.m., where the owner, Mrs., always had a special treat for Duke: unsalted peanut butter cookies made without chocolate. Duke had wolfed his down in 2 bites, and Mrs. had laughed, scratching behind his ears while Sarah nursed her second cup of black coffee. These small moments felt important somehow, grounding her in the normal rhythms of the community she'd sworn to protect. She thought about dinner, probably just leftovers from the night before, and wondered if she'd make it home before midnight. At 9:47 p.m., everything changed. The dispatch crackle made Sarah jolt. "All units, we have a domestic disturbance call, 447 Elm Street. Caller reports screaming, possible child involved. Paramedics are en route." Sarah's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. A child. She'd responded to hundreds of domestic disturbance calls in her career: angry couples, neighbors at war, family feuds. But the moment a child became part of the equation, something shifted in her chest. She'd never had children of her own. Her marriage had ended years ago when her husband decided police work wasn't compatible with his vision of family life. But every child in danger became Sarah's child in those moments. "Unit 22 responding," she said into her radio, already turning the car toward Elm Street. Behind her, Duke sensed the shift in energy immediately. His head came up, ears perked. He knew the difference between routine patrol and an emergency response. His body tensed with purpose. The drive took 4 minutes that felt like 40. Sarah ran through possibilities in her mind: an accident, parental rage escalating to violence, perhaps a teenager. But the dispatcher's tone had suggested something more serious, more urgent. She pushed the accelerator slightly harder, hearing Duke's nails click against the car floor as he braced himself for the turn onto Elm Street. The house was already lit up like a beacon. Red and white lights from 2 patrol cars painted the suburban home in alternating colors. Sarah recognized Officer James Durham's cruiser and saw him standing in the front yard, speaking urgently into his radio. 2 paramedics stood by their ambulance, and as Sarah pulled up, her heart stopped. They were loading a small child into the back. Sarah was out of her car before the engine fully died, Duke's leash already in her hand. The child, a girl, maybe 3 or 4 years old, was being carefully lifted onto the gurney. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the bruising on the tiny arm, dark purplish marks that looked far too specific, far too deliberate. The girl wore pajamas covered in cartoon characters, and her hair was disheveled. She wasn't crying. That was the worst part. She wasn't crying. She was just staring at nothing with the hollow eyes of trauma. "Officer Mitchell," Durham acknowledged her presence with a grim nod. "Thank God you're here. This is bad." "What happened?" Sarah's voice was steady, professional, though every instinct was screaming. "Male subject claims his daughter fell off the couch. Multiple times, apparently. Mother's missing. No one can find her. The father, Wellington, says she left this morning and he's been watching the kid all day. But look at those bruises, Sarah. Those aren't accident bruises. Those are grab marks." And the paramedics found another bruise on her back, shaped like a corner edge, possibly from a wall. Sarah's jaw clenched. She'd seen enough abuse cases to recognize the signature of deliberate harm. Accidents left different patterns: random, dispersed, inconsistent. But these marks told a story of intentional violence. The father. It was almost always the father. "Where is he?" Sarah asked, already scanning the property. "Inside, he's cooperating, which is weird. Usually guys who do this get defensive, angry. He's almost calm, like he's got this handled." Durham's skepticism was palpable. Detectives are en route. They're going to want to photograph everything, process the scene. Sarah looked at the ambulance, where paramedics were securing the child. One of them glanced over at Sarah, shaking his head slightly, the universal gesture of a first responder who'd seen something that violated the basic contract of human decency. The little girl still wasn't crying. That silence was louder than any scream. "What's her name?" Sarah asked softly. Emma Wellington. She hasn't spoken since we arrived. The father says she's shy, that she gets quiet when she's scared. But Durham trailed off, and they both knew what "but" meant. At that moment, Duke pressed against Sarah's leg, and she realized she'd been gripping his leash so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She forced herself to breathe, to center herself. This was why she'd become a police officer. This was why she'd partnered with Duke. Not for the routine calls or the quiet patrols, but for moments like this, when a child needed someone to believe her, to fight for her, to find the truth hidden beneath lies and excuses. "They're going to take her to Riverside General," Durham continued. "Full exam, documented injuries, the works. But here's the problem, Sarah. The father's story is coherent. No obvious signs of intoxication or mental illness. The house is clean, relatively normal. If we can't find the mother to corroborate what happened, if Emma can't or won't tell anyone what really went down." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Without medical evidence of abuse, without a witness, without the child's testimony, a clever defendant with a good lawyer could spin this into an unfortunate series of accidents. A child could fall. Bruises could be misinterpreted. Parenting was messy and unpredictable. Reasonable doubt, that legal concept that protected the innocent, could also protect the guilty. Sarah looked at Emma one last time as the ambulance doors closed. Then she looked at Duke, and Duke looked back at her with those intelligent, dark eyes, eyes that seemed to see through deception and falsehood. "Let's get to work," Sarah whispered. The Riverside Victim Advocacy Center occupied a converted Victorian home on Maple Street, painted a soft sage green with white trim. Whoever had designed it understood that trauma survivors, especially children, needed spaces that didn't feel institutional or clinical. There were no harsh fluorescent lights, no cold tile floors, no metal furniture. Instead, the advocacy center featured warm wooden frames, soft carpeting, and large windows that let in natural light. The main interview room where Sarah and Duke would meet with Emma had been decorated specifically for young children. Murals of forest animals covered the walls. Stuffed animals sat on shelves. A small table with child-sized chairs occupied one corner, and soft cushions were scattered throughout. Detective James had arranged the first visit for the following Monday, 3 days after Emma's admission to Riverside General Hospital. The medical examination had confirmed what everyone suspected. The injuries were consistent with deliberate abuse. Emma's arm bore finger marks suggesting she'd been grabbed forcefully. The bruise on her back matched the corner of a doorframe in the Wellington home. Officers had measured it meticulously. But Emma herself remained silent, traumatized into near catatonia. The hospital psychologist warned that pushing too hard for testimony could cause additional psychological harm. She needed time, safety, and the presence of someone, or something, that made her feel protected. Sarah arrived at the center at 10 a.m. on that Monday morning, Duke at her side. The K-9 had been specially trained in victim assistance work, a relatively rare skill set that required months of intensive training. Duke understood that his role in these situations was different from police work. He wasn't tracking suspects or detecting narcotics. Instead, he was a living bridge between trauma and healing, a non-threatening presence that communicated safety without words. "He's amazing," the center's director, Doctor, said as she greeted them in the hallway. "I've read Duke's file, 43 successful investigations, and he's never shown aggression or impatience. That's remarkable." Sarah smiled, reaching down to scratch Duke's ears. He's special. Most dogs would be distracted or anxious in situations like this. Duke just understands. It's like he knows when someone needs him to be calm. That's exactly what Emma needs, said, leading them toward the interview room. She's been mostly nonverbal since arrival. Won't eat much, won't interact with staff, just sits and stares. The Foster family, wonderful people, by the way, they've tried everything. But she doesn't respond. As they entered the room, Sarah's heart clenched. Emma sat in one of the small chairs, swinging her legs slowly, though they didn't reach the ground. She wore a lavender dress with embroidered flowers, and someone had combed her hair carefully. But her eyes, those were the eyes of someone much older than 3, someone who had seen something that shouldn't exist in a child's world. Emma didn't look up as they entered. Sarah made no sudden movements. She'd learned that with traumatized victims, especially children, false brightness and forced enthusiasm could feel like betrayal. Instead, she simply walked to the far side of the room and sat on one of the cushions, Duke settling beside her with a soft sigh. For the first 15 minutes, they didn't acknowledge Emma at all. Sarah talked quietly about nothing important, the weather, the drive over, how Duke had enjoyed his breakfast. She let Emma get accustomed to their presence, to the rhythm of their voices, to the reality that these 2 newcomers posed no threat. Gradually, Emma's eyes shifted, not toward Sarah but toward Duke. The dog's ears swiveled in her direction, but his body remained relaxed, his head resting on his paws. Sarah continued talking, but now she directed some of her comments toward the dog. Duke, remember when Mrs. gave you those peanut butter cookies? You were so happy. Your tail wouldn't stop wagging. Do you think there might be more cookies someday? As if on cue, Duke's tail began a slow, rhythmic thump against the carpet. Emma's lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but a movement. Progress. Over the following 3 weeks, Sarah visited the advocacy center twice daily, once in the morning, once in late afternoon. She established a routine that Emma began to anticipate. Sarah would always sit in the same spot. Duke would always lie in the same position. And with each visit, the invisible barrier between Emma and them seemed to lower incrementally. By the 2nd week, Emma began tentatively reaching toward Duke. At first, she just touched his fur with one finger, as if she was testing whether he was real. Duke never moved suddenly. Sarah had trained him to accept this behavior without fidgeting or pulling away. The dog seemed to understand that trust had to be earned slowly, brick by brick. "It's okay, Emma," Sarah would say softly. "Duke likes when people touch him. He's very gentle, see? His tail is wagging because he's happy you're here." On the 10th day of visits, something shifted. Emma slid off her chair and sat directly on the floor beside Duke. She buried her face in his thick fur and made a sound, not quite a cry, but an exhale of something held too long. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't move, didn't intrude on this private moment between child and animal. Detective watched from behind the observation glass during each session, his notebook growing thicker. He documented everything, Emma's behavior, her physical responses, any sounds or words she made, her apparent comfort level. But the detective's face grew increasingly troubled as the days passed. Because while Emma was bonding with Duke, she still wasn't communicating details about what had happened. She made no accusations, revealed no specifics, identified no perpetrator. On the 15th day, pulled Sarah aside in the hallway. "This is good work," he said, his voice carrying frustration beneath the praise. "She's clearly responding to you and Duke, but we're running out of time. Wellington has retained a high-powered attorney, David, absolutely ruthless in the courtroom. The prosecutor called me this morning. She's concerned about our case. Without Emma's testimony, without her being able to point to her father and say he hurt her, we're going to have a very difficult trial." Sarah nodded slowly. "You can't rush trauma, detective. She's 3 years old. She watched her father hurt her. That's not something a child processes quickly." "I know," said, rubbing his face. "God, I know, but the law requires evidence. Medical evidence we have. Emma's behavioral response to her father, we might be able to establish that, but we need her to communicate what happened, and I'm running out of ideas for how to make that happen." Sarah looked back toward the interview room, where Emma was resting her head on Duke's side, their breathing synchronized. The dog's eyes were closed, but his body remained alert, protective. "Give us more time," Sarah said quietly, "and trust Duke. He has a way of bringing out the truth in people, even 3-year-old people." Didn't look convinced, but he nodded anyway. Neither of them knew, at that moment, what was about to unfold, how the answers they needed would come not from Emma's words, but from the unusual chain of events that would unfold in the courtroom when these two, the child and the dog, would finally face the man who had hurt them. The courtroom of Judge occupied the 3rd floor of the Riverside County Courthouse, a building constructed in 1962 with all the understated authority that mid-century judicial architecture could muster. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, and a massive judge's bench that seemed to tower above the proceedings like a throne. The gallery was packed this Tuesday morning. Cameras had been prohibited, but journalists sat in the front row with notebooks and recording devices positioned to catch every word. Behind them sat advocates, social workers, and concerned citizens who'd followed the case through local news coverage. The headline had been sensational: "Father arrested in toddler abuse case. Daughter's injuries raise questions about police response." Judge was 61 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She'd been presiding over cases in Riverside County for 23 years, and her reputation was one of scrupulous fairness combined with absolute intolerance for legal chicanery. She'd earned the nickname the Equalizer because she treated prosecutors and defense attorneys with identical scrutiny, assuming neither side could be trusted to tell the complete truth. As she entered the courtroom that morning, her black robe swirled around her, and the bailiff announced her arrival with the formal solemnity the moment deserved. "All rise. The Superior Court of Riverside County is now in session, the Honorable presiding." Judge took her seat and surveyed the courtroom with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen humanity at its worst and best. Her gaze lingered momentarily on Wellington, who sat at the defense table in an expensive charcoal suit, his posture impeccable, his expression serene. He could have been a businessman waiting for a board meeting rather than a man accused of assaulting his 3-year-old daughter. Next to him sat David, no relation to the judge, arguably the most accomplished criminal defense attorney in 3 counties. His conviction rate was enviable precisely because he was brilliant at finding the cracks in prosecution cases and hammering them until the entire structure threatened to collapse. On the other side of the courtroom sat Reeves, the assistant district attorney assigned to the case. Reeves was 47, a former litigator who'd moved to the public sector because she believed in justice as something more than a billable hour. She had a prosecution record of 87%, formidable by any standard, but her face this morning bore the tension of someone who knew this case was different, harder, more slippery. Judge tapped her gavel softly. "Let's begin. Ms. Reeves, you may present your opening statement." Reeves stood, straightening her navy suit jacket. She'd prepared her opening 100 times, practiced it in front of her mirror, refined every word until it struck the perfect balance between persuasive and professional. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice steady and measured. "On October 15th of this year, a 3-year-old girl named Emma Wellington was admitted to Riverside General Hospital with injuries inconsistent with accidental trauma. She bore finger-mark bruises on her left arm, consistent with being grabbed forcefully. She had a contusion on her back shaped exactly like the corner edge of a doorframe in her home. She had minor lacerations on her hands consistent with defensive injuries. These findings, combined with witness testimony and investigative evidence, will establish beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant, Wellington, deliberately and violently assaulted his young daughter." It was a strong opening. Reeves outlined her case methodically, Medical testimony would establish the nature of injuries, witness testimony would corroborate the timeline, and behavioral evidence would demonstrate consciousness of guilt. David's opening was in reasonable doubt. He didn't deny that Emma was injured. Instead, he reframed the narrative entirely. "Your Honor, members of the jury," said, his voice warm and reasonable, almost apologetic. "The prosecution wants you to believe this is a case of deliberate child abuse, but the evidence will show something very different. Children are fragile. They fall. They get hurt. Sometimes those injuries look worse than they are. Sometimes, in our eagerness to find villains, we create them." The defendant, Wellington, is a devoted father who made the difficult decision to call for medical help when his daughter was injured. That decision, that responsible action, is what put him in this courtroom today. I would ask you to remember that throughout these proceedings. The jury, 8 women and 4 men, ranging from a retired teacher to a software engineer to a small business owner, listened carefully. Some nodded slightly at Reeves' opening. Others seemed to lean towards narrative. This was the jury's crucial moment. Before any evidence, before any testimony, they were forming initial impressions that would color everything that followed. The prosecution's case began strong. Doctor, the pediatrician who'd examined Emma, about the medical findings with clinical precision. He used diagrams and photographs. He explained that fingermark bruising required significant force, and that the pattern indicated an adult hand on a small child's arm. He noted that defensive lacerations on a 3-year-old's hands were unusual unless she'd been trying to protect herself. But then David cross-examined, and the dynamic shifted. "Doctor, you've never personally witnessed the circumstances of how these injuries occurred, correct?" "That's correct." "And injuries consistent with being grabbed could also be consistent with a child being held while falling, could they not?" "Theoretically, yes, but—" "And the bruise on her back, while shaped like a doorframe corner, could also match a bed frame corner, or a coffee table edge, or countless other household items." "Yes, but the probability—" "Thank you, doctor, that's all." It was subtle but effective. Had taken definitive testimony and transformed it into possibility. Witness testimony followed. A neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, that she'd heard screaming from the Wellington home on the afternoon of October 15th. Reeves was pleased, then cross-examined. "Mrs. Henderson, you didn't actually see what was happening, did you?" "No, but—" "You simply heard sounds you interpreted as screaming, correct? Children play loudly. They cry over minor injuries. Isn't it possible you misinterpreted what you heard?" "I suppose it's possible." By the end of the second day, Reeves felt the case slipping. The jury's expressions had shifted from certainty to contemplation. Some jurors were actually taking notes supporting the defense narrative. Judge's face remained neutral, but her hands gripped her pen more tightly as each day progressed. She'd presided over enough cases to recognize when reasonable doubt was being systematically constructed, brick by brick, until it became an edifice impossible to demolish. On the third day, the prosecution presented security footage from a camera mounted on a neighbor's garage. It showed Wellington's truck in the driveway on October 15th, consistent with his story. But it didn't show the interior of the home. It didn't show what happened behind closed doors. "The video is useless," Judge muttered to herself, shaking her head. By Friday, Reeves had presented her complete case. The medical evidence remained strong, but had successfully contextualized it within reasonable doubt. The witness testimony had been undermined, and Emma herself remained unable to testify, too traumatized, too young, her words unreliable. As Reeves sat down, she caught Detective's eye in the gallery. He looked as grim as she felt. They both knew what was about to happen. David was about to systematically dismantle the remaining pillars of their case, and unless something unexpected occurred, Wellington, the man who'd hurt a 3-year-old girl, might walk free. Judge gavelled for the afternoon recess, and in that moment she caught Reeves's eye. The judge's expression didn't change, but Reeves saw something there. Recognition, perhaps, that the legal system was failing to deliver justice, and the frustration that came with that knowledge. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn sunshine that felt cruel in its beauty. The courtroom should have been dark and stormy, Reeves thought bitterly as she reviewed her notes one final time. Instead, golden light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating Wellington's face in a way that made him look almost angelic. He sat at the defense table with David, reviewing documents with the casual confidence of a man who knew he was winning. David stood as the morning session began, and Judge nodded permission for the defense's opening presentation. Unlike the prosecution's methodical, evidence-based approach, his defense would be narrative and psychological. He would tell a story that made more sense than the prosecution's version, even if the facts were equally ambiguous. The first defense witness was Doctor, a pediatrician who specialized in traumatic injuries. He was precisely the kind of expert witness who could convince a jury that their common sense should override medical expertise. Was distinguished-looking, with silver temples and the kind of bedside manner that made people trust him immediately. Doctor began smoothly. In your professional opinion, could the injuries sustained by Emma Wellington be consistent with accidental falls? Absolutely, responded confidently. Children are remarkably fragile. A 3-year-old falling from a couch, which stands roughly 2 feet high, could sustain exactly these injuries. The finger marks on the arm could result from an adult catching the child as she fell. The back bruising could result from impact with furniture. I've seen similar injury patterns from simple falls dozens of times. Reeves wanted to object, to point out that interpretation contradicted the medical consensus, but that wasn't how the legal system worked. Both sides presented experts, and juries were left to decide who they believed. This was dangerous territory for the prosecution because it was charming and articulate, whereas Doctor had been clinical and somewhat cold. The next defense witness was Martinez, a social worker who'd been hired by the defense to provide an alternative narrative about the Wellington family. Martinez that she'd interviewed multiple people who knew Wellington, and all described him as a devoted, if somewhat strict, father. In fact, Martinez said, several witnesses expressed surprise at these allegations. They described Mr. Wellington as someone who prioritized his daughter's welfare above all else. Reeves cross-examined aggressively. Ms. Martinez, isn't it true that people who abuse children often present as loving, devoted parents to the outside world? That's one possibility, Martinez conceded carefully. And isn't it true that Mr. Wellington's ex-wife filed a restraining order against him in 2018? David objected immediately. Your Honor, that's prejudicial and irrelevant. Those charges were dropped. Judge sustained the objection, but the damage was done. Some jurors had heard restraining order, and their faces had shifted. Others had noted the objection, which suggested weakness in the defense. The legal system was a complex dance where every step either helped or hindered, and objectivity was a luxury neither side could afford. Then came the testimony that would prove catastrophic for the prosecution. Sandra, Emma's maternal grandmother, took the stand at the defense's request. Reeves hadn't anticipated this witness. The defense hadn't disclosed her until the morning of her appearance, exercising every legal technicality to ambush the prosecution. That Emma's mother, Wellington, had a history of mental illness and had been hospitalized twice for psychiatric evaluation. She left suddenly that morning, said, her voice tinged with what sounded like genuine concern. No note, no explanation, just, gone. I've been worried sick about her. Emma kept asking for her mother and was doing his best to care for the child alone. David leaned forward sympathetically. Is it possible, in your professional opinion, that Wellington inflicted these injuries on Emma before abandoning the family? Objection, Reeves shouted, standing abruptly. Calls for speculation. But Judge looked troubled. Sustained, but the question has been asked and answered in the jurors' minds. This was the brilliance of defense strategy. He transformed the narrative from father abused daughter to abandoned mother injured daughter, and devoted father is being falsely accused. It was elegant, vicious, and devastatingly effective. Reeves spent that evening in her office, sitting in darkness, staring at the case files. Detectives sat across from her, equally devastated. "He's going to walk," said flatly. "Has created enough doubt that the jury will convict themselves they should acquit. We're losing this." "I know," Reeves whispered. She'd prosecuted enough cases to recognize the trajectory. The jury's initial certainty had transformed into contemplation, and contemplation was the enemy of conviction. In a criminal trial, the prosecution bore the burden of proof beyond reasonable doubt. That meant uncertainty was victory for the defense. "The medical evidence is still solid," protested Weekly. "But it's being drowned out by narrative," Reeves replied. "Hasn't had to prove Wellington's innocence. He's just had to create enough alternative explanations that the jury can convince themselves there's reasonable doubt. And he's done that. He's done it beautifully." When proceedings resumed on Tuesday, the emotional temperature of the courtroom had fundamentally shifted. Judge noticed it immediately. The jury members who'd seemed sympathetic to the prosecution now asked careful questions that suggested they were considering the defense narrative. One juror actually smiled sympathetically at Wellington during a break, the smile of someone who decided the defendant was a victim of circumstance rather than a perpetrator of violence. David called his final witness on Wednesday, Wellington himself. This was the ultimate gamble in a criminal trial. If the defendant, he subjected himself to cross-examination, but knew his client was articulate, controlled, and sympathetic when observed carefully. Wellington took the stand in a navy suit, his demeanor grief-stricken but composed. "Mr. Wellington," began gently, "tell the court what happened on October 15th. "I was watching Emma while I'd gone out for some errands," Wellington said, his voice trembling slightly, a masterful performance. "Emma was playing on the couch the way children do. She's always been active, always running and jumping. I was in the kitchen making lunch. I heard a crash, a sound of her falling. I ran in immediately. She was on the floor, crying. I could see a bruise forming on her arm. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified. I called 911 immediately because I wanted her to be safe." It was a perfect narrative, believable, human, filled with the emotional authenticity that cold facts could never match. When Reeves cross-examined, she was forceful but perhaps too aggressive. She asked about the restraining order. She suggested he was lying. She implied he was a predator. But Wellington remained calm, even sympathetic. "I understand why you're angry," he said to Reeves, his voice carrying a note of forgiveness. "You're trying to protect this child. I'm grateful for that, even if you've gotten this wrong." The jury was his at that moment. Reeves could see it in their faces. By Thursday afternoon, the prosecution and defense had presented closing arguments. Reeves made an impassioned plea for the child who couldn't speak for herself. She pointed to the medical evidence, the timeline, the behavioral responses. She urged the jury to trust their instincts about what they'd witnessed. David's closing was masterful. He acknowledged the evidence but recontextualized it entirely. He spoke about the dangers of rushing to judgment, about the importance of reasonable doubt, about how the justice system protected not just the innocent but the falsely accused. "This man," said, pointing to Wellington, "asked for help when he found his daughter injured. He called 911. He cooperated with police. And for that, he's being prosecuted. The real victim here isn't just Emma Wellington. It's this man whose reputation has been destroyed, whose relationship with his daughter has been damaged, all because we were too eager to find a villain." As the jury filed out to deliberate, Judge's face was grim. She'd presided over enough trials to recognize how this would end. The jury would deliberate for hours, perhaps days, creating the appearance of careful consideration. But they'd been converted. They'd been given permission to doubt, and doubt was all the defense needed. In the gallery, Detective put his head in his hands. Reeves stared straight ahead, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the prosecution table. Justice, it seemed, was about to be undermined by the very system designed to protect it. Retrier, the jury deliberated for 8 hours on Thursday. 8 hours that felt like 8 years. Reeves spent them in the courthouse hallway, packing, checking her phone obsessively, reviewing every transcript and piece of evidence, searching for something, anything she'd overlooked. Detective sat slumped in a plastic chair, staring at the floor with the expression of a man watching his life's work collapse. Around them, media representatives speculated about potential verdicts, while advocates for child protection sat in grim silence, understanding what was likely to transpire. At 6:47 p.m., the bailiff appeared. The jury has reached a verdict. Reeves's heart sank. They'd reached it too quickly. Thorough deliberations took time. Quick verdicts usually meant consensus, and in this case, that consensus was likely acquittal. She walked back into the courtroom with the weight of failure pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. The jury filed in, their faces carefully neutral in that way jurors learned, neither celebrating nor mourning the decision they'd reached. The foreman, a retired accountant named, handed a sealed envelope to the bailiff. Judge opened it, read it silently, and her expression didn't change, though Reeves saw her shoulders stiffen infinitesimally. The jury finds the defendant, Wellington, not guilty of assault on a minor. The courtroom erupted. Advocates gasped. Some of Emma's extended family members began crying. Wellington's face transformed into an expression of relief, so profound it looked almost like grief inverting itself. David placed a hand on his client's shoulder, his face a mask of professional satisfaction. Judge gavelled for order, but her eyes were troubled, scanning the courtroom as if she couldn't quite reconcile what had just occurred with her instincts about justice. Reeves stood abruptly and walked out of the courtroom. She couldn't watch the celebration. She couldn't witness Wellington's vindication. She made it to her office, closed the door, and sat in darkness, staring at nothing. Her phone buzzed. It was an email notification, the judge's clerk informing her that Wellington had been released and all charges were being expunged from his record. Emma's case was closed. At 11:47 p.m. that night, Reeves was still in her office. The courthouse was empty, the halls dark except for security lights. She'd been reviewing case law, searching for anything, any legal precedent that might permit an appeal or a retrial. There was nothing. Double jeopardy protected Wellington from being prosecuted again, even if new evidence emerged. The child's medical records remained, but they proved nothing without a cohesive narrative. The jury had spoken, and the legal system had no mechanism for second-guessing them. She stood, walked to the window, and looked out at Riverside's darkened downtown. Somewhere in this city, Emma Wellington was going to bed, possibly to be returned to her father, the man she'd pointed at with one small trembling finger and called bad man. And Wellington was celebrating his vindication, already planning his next moves, already aware that he'd successfully navigated the justice system. Reeves felt something crack inside her chest. She'd been a prosecutor for 19 years and she'd accepted the fundamental principle of her profession. The legal system wasn't perfect, but it was the best humanity had created. Reasonable doubt was necessary. Protecting the innocent from false conviction was paramount. The system, while imperfect, served justice. But tonight, the system had failed Emma. Reeves made a decision that violated every conventional principle of trial practice. She was going to do something unprecedented, something that could backfire catastrophically, that could be perceived as desperation, that could damage her professional reputation. She was going to file an emergency motion for a trial remedy that barely existed in modern jurisprudence. She spent the next 4 hours drafting the document. Her hands shook as she typed. She was acutely aware of the risk. If this failed, it would look like poor sportsmanship, like a prosecutor unable to accept defeat. But she kept thinking about Emma's eyes, about that moment of recognition and fear. By 4 a.m., the motion was complete. It was dense, carefully reasoned, filled with citations to child psychology research and victim advocacy literature. It argued that while the jury had acquitted Wellington, the court retained discretionary power to allow a child victim to be present in the courtroom in the presence of a trained support animal, specifically to allow the child to communicate her trauma response in a safe environment. The motion acknowledged that this was extraordinary, that it violated conventional trial procedure, that it was emotionally manipulative and potentially prejudicial. And then it explained why it might be necessary anyway. Reeves printed the motion, signed it, and submitted it to Judge Chambers at 6 a.m., before business hours officially began. She included a personal cover letter, something she'd never done before. "Your Honor," the letter began, "I understand this request is unprecedented and potentially inappropriate. I understand it could be perceived as poor sportsmanship or professional impropriety. But I would be derelict in my duty to this child if I did not advocate for every possible avenue to ensure her safety and allow her to communicate in whatever manner she is able. I am requesting your discretionary consideration of this motion, knowing that you will deny it if you believe it violates the principles of justice." Judge read the motion that afternoon. Her first response was anger. She called her law clerk into chambers and asked him to research whether anything similar had ever been attempted. He returned with nothing, no precedent, no prior case law, nothing to suggest this was even theoretically permissible. "This is desperate," the judge muttered to herself, "and desperate is dangerous." But then she thought about the moment the jury had announced their verdict. She thought about her instincts honed by 23 years of presiding over cases, screaming that something was wrong, that justice had been perverted, that a man guilty of hurting a child had successfully weaponized reasonable doubt against truth. Judge called both attorneys to her chambers. "I received Ms. Reeves's motion," said without preamble. "Before I rule on it, I want to hear arguments from both sides." Reeves presented her case carefully, arguing that the motion wasn't asking for a retrial or an appeal. It was simply requesting that a traumatized child be permitted to enter the courtroom in the presence of Officer Mitchell and Duke, without testimony or formal evidence. She wasn't asking the jury to reconvene. She wasn't asking the conviction to be overturned. She was simply asking for Emma to be given a voice, however that voice manifested. "Your Honor," Reeves concluded, "we tell children that the truth matters. We tell them to speak up when they're hurt. And then we have a system that refuses to listen to them because they're too traumatized to communicate in conventional ways. Emma didn't get to testify. She didn't get to tell her story. I'm asking for the court to permit her one opportunity to communicate her truth." David's rebuttal was immediate and fierce. "Your Honor, this is precisely the kind of emotional manipulation that undermines the justice system. The jury has spoken. We've accepted their verdict. Now the prosecution wants to parade a traumatized child in front of the jury in hopes of swaying them through emotion rather than evidence. This is a violation of due process. It's designed to prejudice the jury against my client based on the child's emotional response rather than facts. It's unconscionable." Judge listened to both arguments, her expression revealing nothing. She stood and walked to the window of her chambers, looking out at the city below. "This motion is extraordinary," she said finally, turning back to face both attorneys. "It violates conventional trial procedure. It is emotionally manipulative and potentially prejudicial. All of that is true, mister. You're right to object." She paused, and her voice lowered. "However, I also believe that I have a responsibility that supersedes conventional procedure. I have a responsibility to ensure that justice is actually served, not merely performed." His face went pale. "I'm going to grant the motion," Judge continued. "But understand this, Ms. Reeves. If this backfires, if this is perceived as an attempt to manipulate the jury through emotion, I will hold you personally responsible for wasting this court's time and for potentially compromising the integrity of our legal system. Officer Mitchell and the dog will be permitted to bring Emma into the courtroom, but there will be no testimony, no coaching, no attempts to influence her statements. The child will simply be present, nothing more. As Reeves left the judge's chambers, she felt a strange combination of hope and dread. She'd gotten what she asked for, but she had absolutely no idea what would happen next. Sarah Mitchell arrived at the Victim Advocacy Center at 8:30 a.m. on Friday, November 3rd, exactly 3 weeks after Emma's admission to the hospital. The morning was cool and overcast, threatening rain, and Sarah felt the weight of what was about to happen pressing against her chest like a physical force. Judge had called her the previous evening to explain the unprecedented request. "Officer Mitchell," the judge had said carefully, "I'm going to ask you to do something that has never been done before in this courtroom. I need you to bring Emma to court in the presence of Duke, with no guarantee of outcome and no certainty that this will help her case. I need to know if you're willing to do that." Sarah had said yes immediately, but now in the cool morning light doubt crept in. What if Emma suffered additional trauma? What if being in that formal, intimidating courtroom, surrounded by the man who'd hurt her, caused psychological damage that took years to overcome? Sarah was a police officer, trained to follow protocol and procedure. This request violated every instinct she had about victim protection. Doctor met her in the advocacy center's hallway. "She's nervous," said. "I explained to her, as simply as I could, that she'd be going to a special building with Officer Sarah and Duke. I didn't mention her father or the court proceedings. She understands that you'll be with her and she trusts you." They found Emma in the child-friendly interview room, wearing a pink dress with white lace trim. Someone had carefully braided her hair and tied it with matching ribbons. She looked like a doll that had been dressed for display, beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. When she saw Sarah, her entire face brightened, and she ran forward, throwing her small arms around the officer's legs. "Hi, Emma," Sarah said softly, kneeling to the child's level. "We're going to go on an adventure today with Duke. Are you ready?" Emma looked at Duke, who waited patiently, his leash held loosely in Sarah's hand. The dog's massive head came down to Emma's level, and she immediately buried her face in his fur, inhaling deeply as if gathering courage from his scent. "Duke will be with you the whole time," Sarah promised. "And I'll be with you the whole time. You're safe, okay? Duke and I will keep you safe." The drive to the courthouse took 15 minutes. Sarah kept the radio off, letting the silence be a buffer against her own anxiety. Emma sat in a specially installed child seat, Duke's head resting near her through the barrier that separated the rear of the police vehicle. The child's eyes were wide, her thumb occasionally finding its way to her mouth, a regression to more primitive comfort-seeking that Sarah recognized as a stress response. When they arrived at the courthouse, media vans were already positioned outside, their satellite dishes raised like technological flowers searching for signal. Sarah had requested a rear entrance, and courthouse security had cleared it. But even so, she could hear the shouts of reporters as she guided Emma through the back corridors of the building. "Officer Mitchell, is the girl testifying? Will the dog be present during proceedings? Does this indicate new evidence has emerged?" Sarah said nothing, focusing entirely on the small child walking between her and Duke. They took an elevator to the 3rd floor, and as the doors opened, Sarah felt Emma's hand tighten around her jacket. The hallway outside Judge's courtroom was packed. Attorneys clustered in small groups, whispering urgently. Advocates and journalists lined the walls. Detective stood near the courtroom entrance, his face a mixture of hope and concern. He caught Sarah's eye and nodded, a gesture of solidarity and uncertainty. Before entering the courtroom, Sarah knelt in front of Emma one final time. "Emma, we're going to go into a big room now. There will be a lot of people, it might feel scary, But I want you to remember something important. You're the bravest person I know. You've been so brave for so long. Today, we're just going to walk around and you can hold Duke's collar. If you feel scared, you squeeze Duke's collar or my hand, okay?" Emma nodded slowly, her hair catching the fluorescent hallway light. She reached down and grasped Duke's collar in one small fist. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors, and they stepped inside. The effect was immediate and profound. The courtroom, which had been filled with the low murmur of conversation, fell completely silent. All eyes turned toward the small girl entering with the police officer and the massive German shepherd. Cameras had been prohibited from inside the courtroom, but sketch artists' hands froze mid-motion as they attempted to capture this unprecedented moment. Judge looked down from the bench, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes registering the significance of what was occurring. Wellington, sitting at the defense table, straightened slightly. His lawyer, David, placed a hand on his arm, a warning to remain composed. Sarah guided Emma slowly across the courtroom. With each step, the child's eyes grew wider, taking in the towering wooden fixtures, the formal seating arrangements, the sea of faces watching her. Sarah moved deliberately, keeping her pace measured, giving Emma time to acclimate. Duke walked beside them with the calm bearing of a ceremonial animal, his presence somehow making the space less intimidating by his sheer composure. "We're just going to stand here," Sarah whispered to Emma, positioning them in the front section of the gallery with clear to all parts of the courtroom. "You see how Duke is calm. We can be calm too." The jury had been permitted to see Emma's entrance but had been instructed not to interact with her. They watched, their faces a mixture of emotions, sympathy, sadness, confusion about what they were witnessing. One older juror, a woman in her 70s, had tears streaming down her face as she observed the small child. Judge allowed the moment to breathe. She didn't rush the proceedings. She permitted the courtroom to absorb what was happening, the reality of a victim, manifested in physical form in the same room as her alleged perpetrator. This was what the legal system often obscured, the human cost of crimes. Minutes passed. Emma stood quietly, Duke's collar still gripped in her small fist. The dog never moved, never fidgeted, never broke his perfect stance. It was as if he understood at some profound level that transcended training that this moment mattered. Then something shifted in Emma's demeanor. Her head, which had been slightly bowed, lifted. Her eyes began scanning the courtroom, moving methodically across faces, the judge, the jury, the attorneys, the advocates. She was searching for something, someone. Sarah felt the child's body tense. She glanced down at Emma, who had gone very still, her entire being focused with laser intensity on the other side of the courtroom. Emma's gaze had found Wellington. For a long moment, the two of them simply looked at each other, the 3-year-old victim and the man accused of her suffering. Emma's hand trembled slightly on Duke's collar. Wellington's face remained composed, but something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or calculation. Sarah could feel Emma's breathing change, become more rapid, more shallow. The child was experiencing a moment of profound recognition. She was seeing the man who had hurt her in a moment of clarity and terror. Duke sensed the shift immediately. The dog's ears perked forward. His body, which had been relaxed, began to subtly tense. His eyes remained fixed on Wellington with an intensity that seemed almost predatory. Judge leaned forward slightly from the bench, observing everything without intervention. This was the moment, the culmination of 3 weeks of careful work between Sarah and Emma, the point toward which everything had been building. A child was about to communicate something that the legal system had deemed impossible, the unfiltered truth of her experience. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on Emma's shoulder, but she didn't intervene. She simply bore witness to what was about to unfold, knowing that in the next seconds, the entire trajectory of this case would either shift dramatically or confirm that the legal system had indeed failed this child completely. Emma's body trembled like a leaf in wind. Her thumb found her mouth, and her other hand maintained its fierce grip on Duke's collar, as if the dog were the only anchor keeping her from being swept away by the tide of memory and fear. The courtroom held its breath. The courtroom seemed to exist outside of time in that suspended moment. Emma stood motionless, her small frame rigid with tension, her eyes locked on Wellington with an intensity that belied her 3 years of life. Wellington's composure began to crack. His jaw tightened. His fingers gripped the edge of the defense table. David, sensing the shift in dynamics, placed a restraining hand on his client's arm, a wordless warning to maintain control. Sarah remained perfectly still, her hand resting gently on Emma's shoulder. Every instinct screamed at her to comfort the child, to remove her from this traumatic situation, to protect her from what seemed like an escalating moment of fear. But Sarah had learned something profound during those 3 weeks of gentle work with Emma. Sometimes the most protective thing an adult could do was step back and allow a child to speak her truth, however that truth manifested. Judge had risen slightly from her seat, her hands gripping the edge of her bench. Her eyes, which had maintained judicial detachment throughout the trial, were now fully focused on Emma with an intensity that suggested she, too, understood that something momentous was about to occur. The gallery had gone absolutely silent, not the respectful silence of a courtroom following protocol, but the profound silence of witnesses understanding they were present for something singular, something that would be discussed and remembered and analyzed for years to come. Sketch artists' pencils hung suspended over paper. Journalists' recording devices captured nothing but the ambient hum of the courtroom's ancient air conditioning system. Emma's breathing became more rapid. Sarah could feel the child's small shoulder rising and falling against her hand. The girl's thumb remained in her mouth, but her other hand, the one gripping Duke's collar, began to shake with what might have been fear or might have been the gathering of courage. Sarah had seen this before, in victims of all ages. That moment before speaking truth that had been locked away, that instant of gathering strength before breaching the dam of trauma. Duke felt it too. The dog's response was subtle but unmistakable to someone who understood K9 behavior. His ears, which had been forward-facing, pinned back slightly. A low rumble began deep in his chest, not threatening, not aggressive, but something more primal. It was the sound a dog made when he sensed danger, when his protective instincts recognized a threat to the vulnerable creature beside him. Wellington's face paled slightly. He'd maintained his composure throughout the trial, but seeing his daughter's recognition, feeling the weight of her focus, seemed to penetrate his carefully constructed facade. David whispered something urgent to his client, but Wellington wasn't listening. His eyes remained locked on Emma, and Sarah could see something shifting behind them, calculation, perhaps, or the recognition of a gamble about to be lost. Emma's hand, the one holding Duke's collar, began to rise. Slowly, deliberately, with the determination of someone 10 times her age, Emma's small arm extended upward. Her tiny finger, barely thicker than a pencil, pointed directly across the courtroom, across the gallery, across the space that separated victim from accused. Directly at Wellington. "Bad man," Emma whispered. Her voice was so quiet that several jurors leaned forward, straining to hear. Her voice was trembling, fragile, but absolutely certain. 2 words, 2 syllables, but in that moment those words carried the weight of absolute truth. "Bad man." The courtroom exploded internally, not in outward chaos, but in a moment of emotional detonation that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. One juror audibly gasped. Another covered her mouth with her hand. Detective's head came up sharply, his eyes suddenly glistening. But what happened next was what would truly freeze Judge, and transform this moment from emotionally significant to legally unprecedented. Duke's response was immediate and unmistakable. The dog's low rumble transformed into something more pronounced. His entire body tensed against the courtroom floor, his ears pinned fully back against his head. And then, With a controlled but definitive motion, Duke released a trained alert bark, a single, sharp, authoritative sound that echoed through the courtroom like a judge's gavel. It was a bark Sarah had spent months teaching Duke to perform. It was a trained response to specific behavioral cues, a bark Duke only released when he detected what his training had identified as indicators of guilt, deception, or psychological disturbance in a human subject. It was a bark that Sarah had never, in 8 years of partnership with Duke, heard him release in a court of law. Until now. Judge's eyes widened fractionally. Her hand, which had been gripping her pen, went completely still. In that instant, recognized what she was witnessing, a trained K9 responding to behavioral and olfactory cues that humans could not consciously perceive. A dog, an animal incapable of deception, of legal maneuvering, of constructing false narratives, responding with absolute certainty to something in Wellington. The defense table erupted. David was on his feet, shouting an objection. Wellington's face had gone completely white. His lawyer was physically restraining him, preventing him from doing something that would further damage his case. "Your Honor, this is outrageous," was shouting. "This is a complete violation of due process. A trained animal's behavioral response is not evidence. This is emotional manipulation of the jury." But Judge wasn't listening to the objection. She was watching Emma, who had begun to cry silently, tears streaming down her small face while she maintained her grip on Duke's collar. She was watching Duke, whose alert bark had subsided into a continuous low growl, an unmistakable warning directed at Wellington. She was watching the jury, whose faces had a complete transformation from skepticism to certainty. Sarah knelt beside Emma, wrapping her arms around the child while Duke pressed against them both protectively. Emma was shaking now, the enormity of what she'd done crashing over her like a wave. She'd done it. She'd pointed. She'd spoken. She'd told the truth in the only way a traumatized 3-year-old could. "You're safe," Sarah whispered to Emma, pulling her closer. "You're so brave. Duke and I have you. You're safe." But Judge was still staring at Wellington with an expression that suggested something fundamental had shifted in her understanding. She'd spent 23 years studying human behavior, learning to read faces and detect deception. She understood that legal evidence and legal procedure were necessary protections against injustice. But she also understood something that transcended legal training, that a child's recognition of her abuser, combined with a trained animal's instinctive response to that recognition, communicated a truth that was deeper and more certain than any reasonable doubt. "Your Honor," David was still objecting, still trying to salvage his case through procedural argument. "This is completely inappropriate. The dog's response is not admissible. It's not evidence. It's—" "I understand, Mr." Judge said quietly, her voice cutting through his protests with the authority of someone who had just reached an internal decision of profound significance. "I understand completely what you're arguing. The K9's behavioral response is not, by itself, admissible evidence under traditional evidentiary rules. You are legally and procedurally correct." She paused, and in that pause, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "However," Judge continued, "what I am witnessing is not just a dog's behavioral response. What I am witnessing is a child's identification of her perpetrator, combined with the intuitive response of a highly trained law enforcement animal, combined with all the medical, witness, and circumstantial evidence that has been presented throughout this trial. And what that combination communicates to this court is something that supersedes procedural technicality." Wellington's face had gone from white to ashen. His lawyer was whispering urgently, but the attorney's face suggested even he recognized that something fundamental had shifted. Sarah held Emma close, and Duke remained pressed against them both, a living barrier between the child and the man she'd identified as dangerous. The courtroom remained suspended in that moment of profound recognition, not of legal guilt through procedural justice, but of truth, spoken and witnessed and acknowledged, even if that truth had come in the most unprecedented way imaginable. Judge leaned back slightly in her chair, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of a judicial decision that transcended the law. "We will recess for 1 hour. Everyone will use this time to consider what has just transpired in this courtroom. When we reconvene, we will address the legal and procedural implications of this moment. Court is recessed." Her gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo through the ages. The hour-long recess felt like a pressure cooker of emotion and legal deliberation. Judge retreated to her chambers with her law clerk and spent 40 minutes researching every possible judicial precedent, every technicality, every potential vulnerability in what she was about to do. She knew, with absolute certainty, that her next ruling would be scrutinized by appellate courts, dissected by legal scholars, and either celebrated or condemned depending on which side of the justice system one occupied. In the hallway outside the courtroom, competing narratives were already forming. David held an impromptu press conference, arguing that his client had just experienced an egregious violation of due process, that a trained dog's behavioral response was not evidence, that the court had allowed emotion to override law. His words were technically correct, procedurally sound, and utterly hollow to anyone who'd seen Emma's recognition and Duke's alert in the same moment. Detective, by contrast, spoke only to Reeves. The prosecutor stood with her back against the wall, Emma held safely in Sarah's arms while Duke remained at their side, his eyes never leaving the hallway through which Wellington might emerge. "What happens now?" asked quietly. "I don't know," Reeves admitted. "Judge has enormous discretionary power, but also enormous constraints. She can't simply overturn the jury's verdict based on emotional response, but she's intelligent enough to recognize that what just happened communicates something profound about truth." Sarah stood apart from the legal maneuvering, focused entirely on Emma. The child had stopped crying but seemed to have withdrawn into herself, her small body limp with the exhaustion that comes from emotional release. Duke remained pressed against the girl's leg, his presence a constant reassurance. "You did something incredible," Sarah whispered to Emma. "Do you understand how brave you were?" Emma didn't respond verbally, but she reached down and wrapped her arms around Duke's neck, burying her face in his fur. The dog's tail wagged slowly, a gentle affirmation of connection and protection. When Judge reconvened the courtroom, her expression had crystallized into something beyond judicial neutrality. She looked like a woman who had made a decision that transcended legal procedure, a decision that honored both the law and something more fundamental. "The court recognizes," Judge began, her voice carrying the formality of an official record, "that what transpired in this courtroom was unprecedented and procedurally irregular. The K-9's behavioral response is not admissible as direct evidence under traditional evidentiary rules. This court understands and respects that principle." David's face shifted toward satisfaction, but Judge continued. "However, what this court witnessed was not merely a dog's response. What this court witnessed was a child's unambiguous identification of an individual whom she associates with trauma and harm. What this court witnessed was a trained law enforcement animal responding to behavioral and olfactory cues that transcend human perception. What this court witnessed was the convergence of these responses with all the medical, testimonial, and circumstantial evidence presented throughout this trial." She paused, and in that pause, every person in the courtroom understood that something momentous was about to be articulated. "While I cannot overturn a jury's acquittal based on emotional response or animal behavior," Judge continued, "I can and will exercise my judicial discretion regarding the admissibility of all evidence moving forward. I am requesting that the jury be reconvened, not to reconsider their verdict, but to hear additional testimony regarding the significance of the events that just transpired. Specifically, I am requesting that Officer Mitchell provide expert testimony regarding Duke's behavioral training, his alert response, and what his response indicates about his perception of deception or threat. David was on his feet immediately, objecting vehemently, but Judge overruled him with a firmness that suggested her patience had reached its end. "The jury will reconvene in 15 minutes, she declared. "Officer Mitchell, you will be called to provide expert testimony regarding your K-9 partner's behavioral responses and training. This will be admissible evidence, mister, because it goes to the reliability and training of a law enforcement tool, not to the animal's response being accepted as direct evidence of guilt." It was a masterful legal maneuver. Judge was finding a procedurally sound method to place Duke's behavioral response in context for the jury. She was creating a framework through which the jury could legally consider what they'd all witnessed. Sarah for 45 minutes. She explained Duke's training, his behavioral responses, his track record of accuracy in detecting deception and threat. She that in 8 years of partnership, she'd never heard Duke release an alert bark in a courtroom setting, and that his sustained growl and alert posture indicated he detected something in Wellington that corresponded to threat and potential deception. She was careful not to claim Duke could prove guilt. The law didn't permit that. But she could explain what Duke's responses meant in professional terms. The jury listened intently. These were people who'd been systematically taught to doubt, to question, to find reasonable doubt. But they'd also just witnessed something that penetrated all those intellectual defenses. A child and a dog responding with absolute certainty to the same stimulus. The jury deliberated for 12 hours. 12 hours that suggested they were genuinely wrestling with the decision, not simply rubber-stamping one narrative or another. Judge waited in her chambers, chain-smoking coffee, understanding that these jurors were grappling with something profound: the tension between legal procedure and human truth. At 10:47 p.m. on Friday evening, the jury returned. "We have reached a verdict," the foreman announced. The courtroom had been emptied of most observers, but those who remained, Sarah, Detective Reeves, and a few dedicated advocates, returned to their seats. Wellington looked less confident now, his lawyer's hand gripping his arm more tightly, as if physical restraint might prevent an unfavorable verdict. "On the charge of assault on a minor," the foreman read, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision, "we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted, not in celebration but in the sound of justice finally being served. Reeves's hand covered her mouth. Detective's eyes filled with tears. Judge's expression remained composed, but her eyes conveyed something like relief. Wellington's face crumpled. He looked at his lawyer with an expression of betrayal, as if David had promised him freedom and delivered only the law catching up with his actions. Bailiffs moved forward to take him into custody, and as they approached, something remarkable happened. Duke stood pulling away from Sarah's hand. The dog's hackles rose. A low growl rumbled from his chest, not threatening violence but communicating absolute rejection and warning. It was as if Duke were testifying one final time to the jury, to the court, to the world. This man is dangerous, and this animal will not permit his proximity to the vulnerable. Emma watched from Sarah's arms, her face registering something like peace. She didn't smile. She was still a traumatized 3-year-old who'd been through something no child should endure. But her eyes held a clarity that suggested she understood, at some fundamental level, that the person who had hurt her was being held accountable. Judge delivered her sentencing the following Monday. She imposed a sentence of 12 years, substantial enough to communicate the severity of the offense, though not as lengthy as some advocates had hoped. But her written ruling became something larger, a legal precedent acknowledging that, while traditional evidentiary rules remained important, the convergence of child identification, trained animal response, and medical evidence could collectively carry the weight of truth even when individual elements might be questioned. In the weeks that followed, Emma was placed with a foster family who specialized in trauma recovery. Sarah continued to visit her twice weekly, bringing Duke. The dog's presence seemed to catalyze healing in a way that human words could not. Emma began speaking again, slowly at first, but with increasing confidence. She'd never fully recover from what happened to her, but with Duke beside her and Sarah's advocacy, she was beginning to build a life that transcended victimhood. Sarah remained a K-9 officer, but her approach changed. She began training other dogs in victim advocacy work, creating a program that allowed traumatized children to communicate their truth in ways that transcended traditional legal procedure. The program expanded to 3 counties, then 5, then nationally. It became known as the Wellington Protocol, a legal and therapeutic framework that honored both procedural justice and the intuitive wisdom of trauma survivors. Years later, when Emma was 13, she would testify in another abuse case, her voice stronger now but still carrying the weight of what she'd endured. But she would always remember the day she pointed at her abuser and spoke 2 words, words that, combined with the truth that a loyal animal could perceive, finally made the world listen. In a courtroom where justice often felt complicated and elusive, where reasonable doubt could shield the guilty and procedural correctness could protect the perpetrators of violence, one child and one dog had managed to communicate something that transcended legal technicality: the absolute, undeniable reality of truth. Judge kept the sketch from that day framed in her chambers, the image of a small girl pointing, a massive dog at her side, and a judge leaning forward to listen. It served as a reminder that law at its best was not about procedure divorced from humanity. At its best, law was about serving justice, and sometimes justice required listening to voices, human and animal, that the system hadn't been designed to hear. The courtroom doors closed at the end of that day, but the doors they'd opened would remain open for generations to come. Emma had spoken, Duke had, and the world finally had listened. Retry can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.